History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the last few lectures, we've been talking about events in Mexico during 1968, beginning with some background in the years leading up to 1968, and in the last lecture talking about the burgeoning student movement that carried on throughout the summer of 1968. In this lecture, we'll talk about the tragic event that essentially ended that student movement, the Tlatelolco Massacre. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, by the end of September 1968, student protests were carrying on in Mexico City in an atmosphere of relative peace. It seemed the police had called off the dogs, so to speak, and were allowing the protests to go on unchecked. And so in that atmosphere, student leaders called for a massive protest in Tlatelolco Square on October 2nd. This was approximately 10 days before the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. They gathered at a place called the Plaza of Three Cultures, which was a spot of particularly historic significance in Mexico City. The three cultures included ancient Aztec ruins, a Spanish cathedral from the 17th century, and then modern apartment buildings and other buildings around the edges. And in the middle of this was an area called Tlatelolco Square. Again, an important kind of gathering spot and an important spot of historic and cultural significance in Mexico City. Suddenly, at about 6:20 that evening, two helicopters swooped low over the square. A few moments later, thousands of army troops who had quietly observed the protest for most of the afternoon moved to seal off all exits from the square. A third military group, the Olympia Battalion, which had been raised and trained as a security force for the upcoming Olympics, opened fire on the crowd from a number of balconies that lined the square. The crowd was helpless. The unarmed students formed a panicked human wave, rushing from one end of the square to the other, seeking desperately for some escape. They trampled one another, a reckless stampede that left some students crushed in their wake. From every side, the students met death. From bayonets, from gunfire, from helicopters, even from tanks. The killing continued for over an hour, subsided for a few minutes, then resumed. Until 11 o'clock that night, the firing was nearly constant, and stray shots were heard even into the next day. Students fled into the apartments that ringed the square, huddling on the floor with strangers who took them in. Soldiers and tanks saturated these buildings with bullets and grenades, blowing out windows and wounding many people inside. The barrage burst many of the pipes in the building, soaking the terrified students and residents, and contributed to their discomfort and confusion. The troops then stormed the apartments, arresting not only anyone who looked like a student, but many of those who had tried to help them. Those arrested were sent through a gauntlet of soldiers and police, beaten and groped as they were pushed toward the trucks awaiting them. It's unlikely that we'll ever know precisely how many students died in the plaza. There were rumors of dead bodies, even some living victims perhaps, being cremated by police to prevent the true extent of the slaughter from being known. The government, of course, denied these charges, challenging graveyard workers and hospital staff to come forward if they had witnessed such cremations. The official government figure was 38, including 4 soldiers. Observers insist that the total was much higher, some estimating as many as 3,000 killed. But most agree the total is somewhere in between, probably around 300. Several thousand student leaders were taken into custody. Many were tortured by methods including beatings, electric shocks, mental torture, food deprivation, and simulated castration. It would be years before most of the students could consider public protest again, and many were too scarred emotionally to participate in any protest after that night. Historians have been analyzing the events of that night for more than 5 decades, since the happenings on October 2nd. There was a massive cover up and a lot of misinformation sent out by the government in the aftermath of the attack. And of course, the government pointed the initial finger at the students for instigating all of the violence of that night. Over time, historians have managed to piece together most of the elements of the story, although plenty of question marks remain, and the full truth of what happened on the night of October 2nd may never be fully known. One of the mysteries involves one of the leading Mexican officials on the ground that night, General Hernandez Toledo, who was among the first wounded in the fighting. He was shot with a .22 caliber weapon, which is generally not a military-grade weapon, and so the story went out that a student fired the first shot with that weapon and wounded Toledo, who then ordered his troops to fire. But why would students, who had consistently engaged in peaceful protests up to that point, choose that moment to fire a sniper caliber shot against one of the leading Mexican officials and surely spark violence? It just seems unlikely, and a number of scholars have suggested that that first shot was actually fired by a member of the Olympia Battalion or another plainclothes military person who could make such a shot from one of the balconies and then spark the fighting itself. And scholars doubt that Toledo himself even was aware that such a plot was underway. A number of scholars have also noted that there were at least 5 different kinds of military and police presence in the square that night. And so leaders and members of all of those different groups probably weren't aware of what the others were doing. And so there genuinely was a lot of chaos on the scene. And as more and more soldiers and troops and weaponry arrived at the scene and just saw shooting, they simply joined in this kind of mad, chaotic moment with little understanding from above of what the mission was and what exactly was going on. For many years, there was also essentially no video evidence of what had happened. Cameras were seized that night, and so we had no photographs or images of what had happened. And again, over time, and starting with very small numbers, a handful of grainy, low-quality photographs were discovered, and gradually over time, more and more pictures have come out. And so you see a few of those pictures on the screen. Again, we don't have a comprehensive knowledge of what happened, but there are examples of these kind of photographs. Again, I mentioned the total number of deaths remains uncertain, although probably between 200 and 300 seems like the likeliest number. But thousands of students and others were imprisoned that night, and that's what you see in some of these pictures, the students being lined up, and their treatment, mistreatment that night has been well documented. As you see in the pictures, they were lined up, they were beaten, they were taken to various kind of holding centers and then taken off to jail, where some of them were held for lengthy periods of time, really without a trial and without charges being pressed against them. They were just kind of held in secret, and some of them suffering terrible tortures. The accounts of that night have relied on a couple of different sources. One of the most noteworthy of them is Elena Poniatowska's gripping book, La Noche de Tlatelolco, or The Massacre in Mexico, which includes many interviews or excerpts of interviews, comments from the students and others who were involved in the events of that night. And so they provide first-person accounts of the kind of things that happened. And so that book stands as one of the really important sources providing information as far as what happened that night. And once again, the evidence has been slow in coming. We're more than 50 years after that event, and scholars and historians continue to kind of put the pieces together And again, more photographs of that night and the aftermath have been surfacing over the last decade or so. And you see on the top left a very grainy, low quality picture of the soldiers arriving in the square. That was one of the first photographs that was released of this event. And then you see other pictures here as well. At the bottom, of course, the tanks rolling through the scene. That looks like the next day and part of the kind of aftermath and cleanup. And then you also see on the top right the picture of the missing photographs, and that was one of the horrific outcomes of this event. Is in the days and weeks after the attack itself, there were thousands of students who were missing. So I mentioned many of them were alive. They were jailed and undergoing terrible treatment, and then many others were dead. And so for weeks, in some cases, the families didn't know what had happened to their loved ones. In our next lecture, we'll look at the final piece of this event in Tlatelolco, the connections between the student protest and the Olympics.